love it. We've actually got a few seconds before it turns 9:45, so we're starting early today. This is great. All right, everybody, please turn your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 10 as we begin our study of God's Word, which is, as we need the constant reminder, part of the spiritual growth process, which is worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. On last Sunday, of course, we didn't have class on Wednesday because we had singing. We covered Proverbs 3 through 9, and so today we're ready to get into this new section, which is 10 through 29. And this section is called what? I'm sorry, sir?
Teachings of Solomon.
All right, Teachings of Solomon, or Proverbs of Solomon. If you notice in chapter 10 and verse 1 where it says the Proverbs of Solomon. And let's just kind of flip through this section a little bit. Go all the way to chapter 25. Chapter 25. And you'll notice at the heading there, it's verse 1. These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. So more Proverbs of Solomon, but specifically we know who transcribed them. And then if you keep flipping until we get to chapter 30, you'll notice that begins a new section. Chapter 30 and verse 1, the words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, the oracle. So you've got 10 through 29 are kind of two sections, but we'll just consider it as one section, the Proverbs of Solomon. Kind of raises a question. Well, what about chapters 1 through 9? Weren't those Proverbs of Solomon? Well, yes, but what was that section about? 1 through 9. The fatherly instructor. So over and over, my son, my son, my son, my son. And there was sort of a flow there to chapters 1 through 9. Well, now that we start in chapter 10, is there a real flow? I mean, it's just all over the place. And so Solomon just hits so many different topics, and he can jump from one thing to another. These are just short, pithy sayings for the most part that make up chapters 10 through 29. So it wouldn't be very beneficial for us to cover, chapter 10 and 11 and 12 in one class because it would just be all over the map. So what we're going to do is instead, we're just going to do what the book has done and look at categories where all of these various passages can be clumped together into various categories throughout this whole big section of 10 through 29. So that's how we're going to study this big old section. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the contrast between the wise and the fool. We're going to skip the section on the sluggard because Brian is going to preach on that today. And plus, I just had so much material. It was insane. And so that actually helped to just take that out of my notes and let Brian cover that in his sermon. So we'll start out here looking at the contrast between the wise man and the fool. There are a lot of differences, but really there are four main differences that are emphasized in the book of Proverbs. And the first one is that the wise man accepts rebuke, but the fool doesn't accept correction at all. Many passages that say that. Here's just one example. We're not going to have time to turn to all of these because we're going to be bouncing from here to there to there to here, but we will turn to some of them. But I'll put a lot of them up on the screen. 17:10 says, a rebuke goes deeper into one who has understanding than 100 blows into a fool. My daughter, it really doesn't take much. If she's ever done something wrong, and all I do is just raise my eyebrows at her, she can almost break down in tears. It just doesn't take much. And that's how the wise man, the wise person should be, is tenderhearted. We want to do what's right. And if we think we've done wrong, it hurts us and it pains us and we want to change our ways. We have a soft heart. But the fool is not that way. You can beat a fool and he still won't get the message. He still won't change because he doesn't want to. And that's the point of this passage. Second contrast between the wise and the fool is the wise man guards his lips, but the fool, he doesn't guard his lips at all. So several passages on this. Let's look at a couple. 11 and verse 12, he who despises his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding keep silent. In other words, we kind of know when to keep our mouth shut. Because if we say something, our neighbor is going to find out that we said that, and then you're going to have this bad relationship with your next door neighbor. That's not good. And so the wise man knows kind of when to keep his mouth closed, his lips shut, but not the fool. Chapter 15 and verse 2, the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable, but the mouth of fools spouts folly. So not only does the wise person know when to not talk, but when he does speak, he wants it to be helpful. What does Paul say in Ephesians 4 and verse 29? Let no corrupt word or unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for what? Edification, according to the need of the moment, that it may give, does anybody know how the rest? Grace to those who hear. It's a great verse to memorize if you've never memorized that, Ephesians 4:29. So we want to impart grace. Holly is constantly reminding our kids, let your speech be seasoned with salt. That's how Paul says it in the book of Colossians. And so we want our speech to be helpful. We don't just want to know when to not talk, but when we do talk, we want it to be helpful. So the wise man makes knowledge acceptable. In other words, he knows how to make knowledge palatable. There's a way to impart knowledge that you could really sound like a jerk. And you could offend people unnecessarily. And there's a way to impart it that makes it acceptable. So that's a beautiful verse. Third contrast, the wise man pays attention to results and consequences, but not the fool. He doesn't pay attention to anything except for what's right in front of him. Chapter 14, verses 15 and 16 says, the naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. A wise man is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is arrogant and careless. Careless. So, it's so simple. Most of this doesn't require any commentary to be easily understood. That's one reason I love the Proverbs. They're so simple, so straightforward. Now, here's another one in Proverbs 22 and verse 3. There's another verse that's almost verbatim like this one in Proverbs. The prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive go on and are punished for it. I talked last week about some driving advice that my father gave. One of his pieces of advice that I talked about last week was just expect everybody on the road, to be stupid, and most of the time you won't be disappointed. That's how my dad said it. Well, another good piece of driving advice, not quite as sassy as that one, that my dad gave me is don't look at the road here right in front of you and at the cars right in front of you, but look down the road as far as you can see. And I had to think about, well, why do I need to do that? Well, the reason is so I can see if there's trouble coming, if there's an accident up there, somebody that's not, turning on their turn signal, but they're about to turn, or whatever it might be. Somebody's pulling out, and they may be, way up there, but if I'm not preparing for that now, I could run into trouble. So I always thought that is a great parable of sort of how the Christian should live life. That we should look down the road of life, and we should see if trouble's coming. And it might not be here now, but we can see it coming, and I'm going to turn and get on a different road. I want to get out of the way. The fool, he doesn't see that at all. He doesn't think any further than the hand in front of his face, sadly. So as we kind of summarize, or as we bring this section to a close, I want to mention here, we need to be very aware that the wisdom that he's talking about here is not, of course, worldly wisdom. He's not talking about the kind of wisdom that might help you just get up the corporate ladder, for example, even though he does talk about some practical things of that nature, as we'll talk about later, success in business dealings and so forth. But we just have to understand, a well-educated person can be very foolish in the ways of God, can be very ignorant of the ways of God. And so we're talking about a godly wisdom. The truly wise man is the one who bases his whole life upon the fear of the Lord. Now let me ask a question for all of you. I'd like to hear your input. How can we become more wise and less foolish? Because let's admit, all of us have a little bit of this foolish man in us. All of us at some time or another, we don't accept rebuke very well. Maybe from your spouse, for example. At some point, All of us let things slip out of our mouths that we shouldn't say, things that were unthoughtful and not helpful. At some time or another, all of us just kind of pay attention to what life is, what's happening right in front of us, and we don't think about consequences and so forth. So how can we attain more wisdom and become less like the fool? Any hands? All right, Terry? Sorry.
In my life, I feel like I've progressed in the area the most because I've surrounded myself with people who are of that.
Oh, good. That's a great one. Surround yourself. I can't remember if it was like Jim Collins or what motivational speaker it might be that said that we are basically the sum total of the 5 people we spend the most time with. And so that's pretty much true. Jason and then Bill.
Choose to do it, and choose to do it actively. Intelligence or whatever, book smart, that's God-given. But wisdom is not. I mean, I think the very point you're making is that intelligent people can be very foolish. Yes. And it's to choose to be wise, but not just to choose to be wise, but to choose which wisdom we will pursue.
Very good.
And so, are we going to make foolish choices from time to time? Yes, we are. But we need to learn from those mistakes, and we need to continue to try to fill our minds with wisdom. But it's active and it's a choice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we have to first of all discern what wisdom is and recognize it as true wisdom, and then actively pursue it. That's great. Very simple. Bill?
Simply speak before you think.
Yes, sir. That's right. Yes, sir. Think before you speak. That's a good one. John?
Going back to the naive kind of the thing, what Jason said, you can have some book smarts, but wisdom comes from experience most times, and we've always heard this phrase of forgive and forget. I have real issues with forgetting, because I've been in situations where it might have been a little naive and gullible because you're younger. And sometimes older people, they look at that, but they can be really sincere and really good at selling themselves and thinking that they're looking out for your best interest. And then you get into a situation that may not be in your best interest. You really shouldn't forget those episodes. You can forgive that individual, but you might want to store that little episode in the back of your head and going, oh yeah, remember that? Sometimes these people can hurt themselves, making themselves look really...
That's a great point. Jesus said to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So, yeah, that's a great point. And, one thing that nobody has said yet, James 1, what did James say? If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and beyond reproach. So God will give you wisdom. I have to move on here. So typically I might take 3 or 4 comments and then I've just got to book it. I'm sorry, I've just got to keep moving. So, let's see. I kind of skipped one. The last one is pretty straightforward. The wise man loves wisdom and not the fool. So let's talk now about children and parents. In Proverbs, there are a lot of important principles that are taught about the relationship between parents and children. I think sometimes we think that really the Proverbs only talk about, disciplining your children with punishment, kind of the idea of spare the rod, spoil the child, which actually isn't in the book of Proverbs. The sentiment is. But actually, the book of Proverbs has a lot more to say about the relationship between parents and children. So again, there are 4 things we're going to look at. But let me mention this first. The word discipline doesn't only mean corrective discipline. What does the word discipline really, in a general sense, mean? Right. So making a disciple out of somebody. It was the idea of teaching. When Paul said in Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Did he only mean, when he said discipline, hey, parents, make sure to spank your children? No. He's talking about the big picture approach of training our children. So we need to recognize that as well. And in many of these Proverbs, the word discipline is used in that more broad, general sense. But there is a context that each verse can kind of help us understand what's being meant. And Though Proverbs heavily emphasizes the duty of children to behave wisely, well, there's a flip side of the coin there. If children are supposed to behave wisely, what does that mean for parents? Well, we need to make sure and instruct them how to behave wisely. They don't know. They don't come out of the womb knowing how. They're not automatically going to know how. They have to be shown and taught how. So let's start with that idea. Parents, discipline your children. In 1918, Solomon said, "Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death." Now that discipline there is apparently a broad discipline, but do it while there's hope. And if we don't discipline them, bad things are going to happen. Here's another one. Proverbs 13:24, "He who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently." In that passage, the disciplining is spanking. Now, this can be a sensitive issue in our modern culture. Some of you remember as kids getting spankings. You can remember getting spankings with paddles. Any of y'all remember that? I do. I saw some hands go up. Some of y'all can remember, and I heard a lot of this from like my parents' generation, that they were told by their mom, if they did something wrong, go outside and get a switch. And if they brought it in and it was too small, what did the mom say? Go get a bigger one, right? And that just has to be such a horrific experience, getting your own switch. And so the idea of this passage is not just spanking, but it's using an instrument to spank the child. In this passage, it's the quote, rod. Now, this doesn't mean brutal beating. We're not talking about child abuse. And we need to be very sensitive on this and very careful that I'm not communicating and that we don't think that Proverbs was condoning child abuse. No. But just like we who got spanked with paddles and spanked with switches, we understand that, or sometimes maybe even a belt, that there was a little bit more of a message that was sent with the use of that instrument. But that can be done without it being child abuse. But it doesn't need to be taken off the table altogether. Spanking. Well, I don't want to hurt my child. The thing is, sometimes parents think, I don't want my child to think that I hate them. You know what's ironic about that? If you don't spank your child when your child really needs that, or we can broaden that and say punish them in general when they really need it, what does this passage say your attitude towards your child really is? Hatred. It doesn't mean you literally are hating them, but it means for practical purposes, if you're not going to deal with their misbehavior, you might as well hate them, because that's going to be horrible for them. It's going to be horrible for them. So he who loves his child disciplines him diligently. It is love. It is love, because you know that that's going to be better for that child, just like our Heavenly Father disciplines us for our benefit, Hebrews 12. So, did I look at 13:24? Okay. Let's move now to the second subpoint. Children, pay attention to your parents. In 13:1, a wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. So a parent can do his level best to discipline in the sense of punishment or in the sense of teaching in general. But if his child doesn't receive that discipline, if the child is not willing to change, then nothing good is going to happen. But is that the parent's fault in that case? No, it's the child's fault. So it takes two. It takes the parent doing the disciplining, and it takes the child receiving the discipline. The child has the choice to either change or not change. And so it's a two-way street. Thirdly, children should not misbehave their parents. One of the worst things a child can do is to show disrespect or to curse or to afflict the very ones that brought him into this world and that provide everything for him and love him the most in this world, or her. 19:26 says this, "He who assaults his father and drives his mother away is a shameful and disgraceful son. You may have heard me talk about before, I know a young man who was at a very nice, expensive college that his parents were paying for, and he had this nice car that his parents had bought for him, provided for him in every way. Mid-semester, he just decided to up and leave without a word to his mom and dad of explanation, without any word of appreciation for what they had done for him, the sacrifice they had made for him, and the opportunities they had given him. And he left and went to a faraway state where, he just hoped nobody would find him. And he moved in with a family of atheists as he turned from the Lord and became one himself and cut off all communication with his mom and dad. It tore his parents apart to know that their child did that after all that they had done for him. That is a slap in the face. Now, that's an extreme example. But that's one real life example that I have seen of a child that has become an adult that does that. And so, to follow on the heels of that point, finally here, foolish children bring grief and shame to their parents. Chapter 17 and verse 25, for example, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. So that's good motivation for we who are children, even when you get older, to not be a grief to your father and not to be bitterness to your mother, not to disappoint them and disrespect them. So as we wrap this section up, let me ask, why do so many parents in our culture, why do you think so many parents in our culture fail to punish their children for what they've done wrong? What are your thoughts on that? Why do so many parents just not really punish our children like needs to be done? Jared, did your hand go up?
Yeah. I think a lot of people these days have the attitude that if I punish my child's not going to love me. Mm-hmm. And there's this insecurity about taking an authoritative role with your children because they won't love you.
That's right.
Which is really the opposite.
It is, isn't it? So if you do discipline them, and you do it right, again, we're not talking about child abuse, they will love you more. Because children know intuitively that they need that. Very good. Very good. Tom, did your hand go up? Oh, sorry. I need somebody over in this general area. Let me call on somebody who hasn't answered yet. This Tom.
The standard has been removed, or is being removed, that defines why we should love our children and care to prevent those things. There's no motive or less motive to make those decisions with your children. So, I'm not blaming it all on everybody else. We have the decision to make.
Sure.
But when God is removed, then the pillar is cracked.
That's right. If there's really no moral standard anyway, then what behavior are we trying to correct our children for, and so forth. That's a great point. Jack, and then Herb.
I can tell you why I didn't spank my daughter, 14-year-old daughter, is because she had already lied about so many complaints that had been believed by the children's services. And I knew that if I spanked her, I would probably be in jail, but not be able to help my wife and my son. So I just simply said, there's nothing I can do about this situation right now.
Yeah.
Now, my daughter is a good person now. She was not at the time, but she is a very good person now, and I love her a lot, and she loves me. But there were so many things that she did. She had somebody put a bruise on her face about the size of a golf ball, and she told everybody that I hit her. And two of her friends were in the house talking with joy at me because she had run away and nobody knew where she was. And they were looking kind of funny at me. They would look at one another and they'd look at me, and they'd look at one another and look at me. And I'd say, did Nancy tell you that I hit her and gave her that mark? I said, look at my hands. Could my hands do a mark that small? It looked like I said, it was about the size of a golf ball. Yeah. And those girls immediately got up and went out and began searching for Nancy.
Yeah, so I appreciate you bringing that up. I don't think anybody in here would fault you for that. In that situation, for not spanking your daughter, I don't believe the Lord would fault you for that either. But of course, that's a different situation than parents who just turn a blind eye and they're not gonna even pay attention to the wrong that their children are doing. So, but thank you for bringing that up. Megan?
Well, I mean, to Jack's point, I think there is a lot of fear these days.
Yeah.
I mean, if anybody even thinks you touched your kid, they're going to be taken away from you. Like, I mean, I've had some very stressful mornings before school where I've spanked Devin on the leg and there was a little bit of a red mark, and then I'm afraid to take him to school.
So we do have to take those things into account. We do have to take those things into account and be wise about all of that. But not just spanking, okay, but just discipline in general. Some parents are afraid to put their kids in timeout because they don't want to hurt their little feelings, So I think we've touched on some reasons. And of course the point is we should make sure that we do punish our children and that we don't just let their misbehavior go totally undealt with. It doesn't always have to be spanking. In fact, spanking, especially as your children get older, should really be pretty rare. And now we almost never spank our children. I mean, I can't even remember the last time that we've had to do that because there are other forms of discipline that work. My dad always said when he was a boy, spanking never worked for him, but a good talking to. Just explain to him, and that really worked for him. But when he got spanked, he got madder and more stubborn. So we do have to look at each child and how each child responds and what punishment is most effective for each child. There's a lot of balance in this whole thing, so please don't say that I'm just saying, hey, parents, start spanking your children more, without me knowing your situation. I'm not saying that, okay? We have to move. There's so much we could talk about. Let's talk about fruits of wickedness and righteousness. So the results, the fruits of how living a wicked life leads your life to be, and same thing with righteous. So first of all, righteousness delivers one from calamity. Now, is this always the case? Obviously not. But, it's a general rule. We learn from Job that you can't always just look at your circumstances and know if, your circumstances reflect how you're living. It doesn't always work that way. A lot of it does have to do, as John made a very good point talking about last week, with our environment. If we work, for example, in a corrupt environment, then righteousness might not avail at all in that situation. It might actually be worse for you, not that you need to stop being righteous, but a lot of it does have to do with our environment or even who is ruling the land and the righteousness that is appreciated and regarded in general in those sorts of ways. But we're talking here about some generalities. So let's look in 14, 11, and 12. Proverbs 14, we'll turn there. Proverbs 14, 11, and 12 says, "The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is a way of death." That's a very famous verse of Proverbs there, 14:12. We can all look back at decisions we've made, certain decisions, certain choices, certain paths we've gone down and say, I thought that was a good idea, but that was a disaster. That was a really bad idea. Well, why didn't we make that decision? Because we weren't operating with wisdom. Maybe we didn't pray about it. Maybe we weren't being careful at all. So that certainly can be the case. Secondly, righteousness has a secure reward. Lots and lots of verses on this. Let's just look at a few. Look in 14:22, chapter 14, verse 22. "Will they not go astray who devise evil? But kindness and truth will be to those who devise good." I love that verse because there's that idea, there's this parallelism, but it's kind of the opposite idea, but sharing the idea of devising. So you have the wicked person and he's devising evil, and you have the righteous person who's devising good. He's not just doing good, he's devising it. He's planning for it. That's his plan of life. And what will come to him is kindness and truth. That's a very general rule. Verse 34, famous verse. "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people." So this principle of this secure reward of righteousness isn't just on an individual basis. It's true for nations as well. Chapter 15 and verse 29. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. Another reward for the righteous is that God hears our prayers. Verse 8 of that same chapter speaks to that same point. There's so much, so hard to know what to mention and what not to mention, but I have to mention this verse because it's quoted in the New Testament. 11:31, if the righteous will be rewarded in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? That verse is a tricky one to know how to translate. How to, not translate, but interpret. Because there are different versions that render it a little differently. And so the best way I know how to understand that verse is to see how Peter used that verse. And so in 1 Peter 4, that's not what I meant to do. 1 Peter 4, Peter said, for it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. So he's saying that suffering is happening to Christians. And it's not happening to non-Christians. That's what he's saying. It's beginning with the household of God. He says, and if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? So you see the point he's making? If the righteous suffer, then what do you think is going to happen to the wicked? Maybe not right now, but eventually. They're going to get even worse suffering. That's the point. And look where he goes to make that point, to prove that point, is Proverbs 11:31. And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? So it's rendered a little differently there than it reads in our English Old Testament. Part of the reason is he's quoting from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Anybody remember what that translation is called? The Septuagint. And so that's how the Septuagint renders that verse in the Old Testament. And the idea is the righteous person is saved, but only through difficulty. It's going to be hard. You're going to have to suffer. And if the righteous person is saved only through difficulty, what about the wicked who don't serve the Lord at all? Well, they're going to be totally lost. Totally lost. So it's a fascinating way to use that verse and to help us to understand that verse. By the way, there's some misunderstanding on that verse from the New King James Version, maybe the King James Version. It says something like, the righteous is scarcely saved. If the righteous is scarcely saved, and sometimes people make the point, well, see, even the righteous people are scarcely saved. You just barely make it to heaven by the skin of your teeth or something like that. That would be a very hopeless verse for the people who are righteous. The righteous are saved abundantly. And so I like the rendering in the New American Standard. It is with difficulty that the righteous is saved. That's, I think, the proper rendering. So anyway, let's talk now about the third point here. The righteous one does righteous deeds. That should be pretty obvious. That's how he is defined by his deeds. 21:15, the exercise of justice is joy for the righteous, but it is terror to the workers of iniquity. The reason I love that passage is because it's not just that the righteous person does the right things, but he takes pleasure in it. So we actually, it's like an acquired taste. And we get to the point where doing the right things is rewarding. And the wicked person, they can't understand that. They go, how could that stuff be enjoyable? I want to run from that. I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, right? So that's where we need to get in our pursuit of righteousness. Fourthly here, the righteous one seeks the good of others. So many verses we could look at, but I had to hone it down to one, narrow it down to one. I love this passage, y'all. Proverbs 11:30, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who is wise wins souls. The fruit of the righteous. That means the fruit that we bear is a tree of life for others to eat. So our lives should influence others and seek for the benefit of others spiritually. He who is wise wins souls. We're winning people over to this thinking that I want that wisdom. I want that tree of life. I want that fruit. This is a great verse for evangelism, by the way. So many other things we could talk about. Let me ask you as we wrap up this section, practically speaking, how can we be a tree of life to the people that surround us? How can we be a tree of life? Debbie?
Well, you have to remember that whether we know it or not, people are watching us.
That's right.
And it has really surprised Randy and I sometimes. We
live in a condominium. We don't know everybody around there, but we've had on more occasions that, that's surprising. We'll have people say, oh, we see you going to church, or we see you and your husband, or we see how you keep your yard up, or people notice whether we know it or not. They are watching.
Yeah. I found it very surprising one day when I was moving a giant mirror that I had sold or bought from somebody. It was for a thing I was doing with karate, and I wanted a mirror on the wall. And we talked for a little while, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I preach." He said, "I thought so." I was like, "What? What do you mean?" He just said, "I could just tell." And so it's nothing, I'm not putting me up on a pedestal, but we've all had experiences like that where people just tell us there's something different about you. Something different about you. Did you have your hand up or wiggle a finger or something? Okay. If you wiggle a finger, be careful, I'll call him. All right, Joe?
I think we need to also reflect on who is the tree of life for us. In other words, how do we be a tree of life for someone else?
Yeah.
Look at the kindness, the gentleness,
That's
the
right.
patience, whatever it would be that someone brought to bear for us.
Very good.
That, we should be the same. Obviously,
I appreciate it.
It would be different for the different person, but the same concept.
That's right. Yeah, great. Very good. All right, any other thoughts on how can we be a tree of life to others? As you think about evangelism, it is so much more to do with your example than just the nuts and bolts of what you say in a given situation. People are, like Debbie said, they're watching. And that will lead to opportunities when you're interacting with people in the world. Hurt?
Is this connected to the fruits of the Spirit in the New Testament? Because if it is, then it would be natural. It's who we are and what we do becomes a tree of life. The tree of life in Genesis was the source of knowledge, and the source of connection to God.
Yeah,
so
very good.
By our deeds, by our actions, by who we are, can be a connection to God.
Amen.
I think that's what it's about.
Amen. And there has to be, at least in that way, a connection, to Galatians 5 and the fruit of the Spirit. Amen. That's a great point. Let's move forward and talk now about warnings about business dealings. We'll kind of fly through this one. First one is work diligently. I'm going to let Brian talk more about that in his lesson. Secondly, be fair and honest in all business dealings. Common sense stuff. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is His delight. Wrong button. Okay, someone in the back, you're going to have to help me out. That's okay. Third one is, Third one is beware of standing good for another man's debts. We talked about that at some length from chapter 6, the previous section, but that's all through this section of the Proverbs of Solomon. And fourth, be savvy in your business dealings. Just some very practical stuff like where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes by the strength of the ox. I like that. You'd rather not have the ox and deal with it, and clean up after it. But boy, having it sure helps business. So there's a principle there that we can apply even today. Or 15:22 says, without consultation plans are frustrated, but with many counselors they succeed. So we don't need to just go it alone and think we can just figure it out on our own. We need to draw from others. So many other things we could say here. And I also wanted to talk about materialism, but I don't want to rush it through here at the end. So I'm going to leave that for Wednesday, and I'm going to leave you all the last minute and 20 seconds for any comments, any questions throughout the whole thing. Do what?
You got 6 minutes for 20 seconds.
Oh, because it ends at 10:30.
Yes.
I got confused in my head. I was looking at that and thinking 10:25 for some weird reason. Okay, we're going to just keep on going. But let me ask you this at the end of that section. Can you provide me with some modern day examples of a false balance and false scales? Modern day examples.
Saying one thing and then not following through with it. You tell somebody, hey, I'm going to, just for lack of another example, I'm going to mow your grass for $20, and then you mow their grass and you say, oh, also trim the edges, you owe me another 10.
Very good.
I see it constantly in my business. Constantly. They call them change order contractors.
Change order contractors. They have a term for it. So sad. So sad. Yeah, so there's very little integrity. That's one of the things about righteousness that should set us apart, that should lead to more success in the world, is when people see that that person actually has integrity. They do what they say, and they don't charge more than they said they would. That's kind of unusual in a lot of areas in business. So let's do Chloe and then Randy.
I was going to say, so recently I went through this with my friend. We were talking about moving out together, and she seemed very serious, so we were looking at like apartments, and it's just, I don't know if that's a modern day contract, but she wasn't serious about it, but she gave like the impression it was. So I think giving an impression that causes another person to go out and look for stuff, and we were talking about putting like a lease or something. So in that case, if she had then decided after, I put a lease down that she didn't want to, that could have left me in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah. So we just need to be very honest about our intentions and not kind of mislead people in that way or lead people on in different ways. That's a great example.
I couldn't quite hear all of what Terry said, this may be similar, but bait and switch. They advertise this, and you go down there, and immediately they try to get you to something else.
Yeah. And we've experienced that in like car repair shops and things like that. So, very good. Let's talk now about materialism. Materialism. So, 4 things again. First of all, joy, real joy does not come from one's possessions. A lot of passages on this. I love this one in 15, 16, and 17. Chapter 15, verses 16 and 17. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. Better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fattened ox served with hatred. Sometimes there's a little humor in some of these verses and very vivid imagery sometimes as well to make the point. And there are a lot of passages like that it's better to have a little and have peace and have the Lord than to have a lot and have all the trouble that comes along with it. More money, more trouble, so they say. It's true. And what did Paul say in 1 Timothy 6? That godliness with contentment is great gain. It is great gain. That's where true happiness is. That contentment, you can't buy that, can you? You can't buy that. 16:16 says how much better it is to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen above silver. Solomon had both, silver, gold, and he also had wisdom. He knew which one was better. Secondly, be generous, not greedy. Pretty straightforward point. Look at this as an example. 19:17 says, one who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed. I love that. When you're giving to the poor, you're lending to the Lord. Jesus talked about in Matthew 25 that if you visit the sick and you visit those who are in prison and you give cold water to one who is thirsty, you're actually doing all of that for the Lord. And so we need to think about that when we help the poor. Sometimes we despise the poor, but we need to be gracious to a poor man and realize that when we are generous, the Lord has a way of bringing that back to us. In this passage it says that when we give to the poor, we're lending it to the Lord. And so the Lord's going to give it back. It's not the prosperity gospel. It's not the reason we should put money in the contribution plate. It's not the reason we should help people, but it's the way that the Lord works. He knows when we're generous. And so it should help you to know, yes, it hurts to give this, but God's going to take care of me. That's a powerful point. Thirdly, do not trust in riches. I love this verse. Chapter 23, verses 4 and 5. Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eyes on it, it is gone, for wealth certainly makes itself wings like an eagle that flies toward the heavens. Oh, my 401k. Yeah, and then it's gone, right? We can't trust in money and wealth. Fourth and finally, beware the evils of ill-gotten gain. So many passages on this point. Bread obtained by falsehood is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be filled with gravel. I love that one. So over and over this idea that yes, there may be some immediate benefit to ill-gotten gain, but in the end, it's going to come back to bite you. So many other verses we could talk about. I was going to leave time for comments, but I failed. And we only have 10 seconds left, so can't do that. I'm sorry about that. Please read through page 191A of your book for Wednesday night. Thanks so much.